Bruce Janz, welcome to Hildesheim. We are very happy that you are a guest of our new Center for Advanced Studies.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being here.
My first question is, you are one of the few scholars outside Africa who are working on African philosophies or philosophies of Africa.
Right.
So my question is, how did all this start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I almost want to say accidentally. So in the 1990s, my ex-wife was a development worker in Kenya, and she had various contracts. She worked for Christian Reformed World Relief Committee, and so she did, food security work and kind of small business work. She worked with women with business circles to kind of increase the capacity in that area. And so she would have a contract. I would, teach my term, and then I would go over and see her during the summer. And so that was in, I did that several times. It was in kind of near the border of Kenya and Uganda. And while I was there, I just started dropping by the philosophy department. If I was in Nairobi, I would go by University of Nairobi philosophy. Just started buying books, started talking to people. That's where when I met people like Odira and Nyerwath, I met Odira Oruka at that time. For me, I didn't know who these people were. It was just, interesting to talk to, see what the philosophers were doing there. And then one day, Emmanuel was coming through. And anyone who knows African philosophy, I think, will have encountered Emmanuel before. He was very prolific and very influential. And so he and I got talking and realized that we had more in common with each other in some ways than either of us had with anyone else in the department. We had similar kinds of intellectual background. And so, if anyone knew Emmanuel, they would know that he's kind of I think of him as a philosophical entrepreneur. I mean, he was just starting things all the time. And so, I got back to Canada. I was teaching in Canada at the time. He was in the US. And he just sends me an email one day and says, "Hey, I'm doing this book called Postcolonial African Philosophy. Do you want to contribute a chapter?" And I said, "What, are you crazy? I mean, white Canadian guy, who doesn't have, what do I have to say? This is not my place." I think I remember saying that to him, which is significant because I do work on place. He said, no, I think, from our discussions, you can do this. And I said, but look, there's a long history of people that look like me coming into Africa and telling people how things are, how they should think about things, and it never ends well. It never looks good. And his advice was, listen to what people are saying. Talk about the things that people are talking about. Don't go in thinking you know. And he was right, And so I started that way, and I have to say that, I wrote that first essay for that volume, and then I just started doing more and more. I met more and more people. I met Kai Kresa and Gail Presby, and I met lots of, Kenyan philosophers after that. And then I started running into other philosophers at conferences, and it just kind of started going from there, and I realized that there was a really interesting intersection on my work around place and space and work around African philosophy, which was really a kind of central question which I wanted to ask, which is, what is it to do philosophy in a place? And I thought that Africa was a great kind of testing ground, if nothing else, for articulating that question. So yeah, that's how it started, and it just kind of kept going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. You did not only write this very influential book, Philosophy in an African Place, but as far as I'm informed, you also teach philosophy in Africa or concepts from the discourse of African philosophy. Why do you think is it important to teach African philosophy in the place of the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think it's very important, actually, because, part of how I think about philosophy in place is that place is a kind of site for creation of concepts. And what I've seen in African philosophy is is a process among many people of trying to think through what being in a place actually means. And it's a place that's very fraught in many ways. I mean, it's a place that's been colonized. It's a place, in some cases, with apartheid. In some cases, people taken from their place in slavery, but a lot of other place aspects as well that aren't about colonialism and all of those things too. And people trying to think through what concepts are adequate to work in this place. And so when I teach in the U.S., the tradition, I think, is for a lot of people is to just talk about the concepts of some philosophers. Like, we're going to talk about Kant. Well, what did Kant think about, aesthetics or this or that or the other thing? And you don't get a sense of a creative spirit there. And what I want to give students is a sense of a creative, inquiring spirit. What does it mean to struggle with ideas and come to a concept that actually helps you to understand the place that you're in? I see that in Africa. I see it elsewhere too, right? And I do teach philosophy from other parts of the world, but I think Africa is such a great a space to think about that with, and something that I think is often lacking in the way philosophy is taught in North America.
Mm-hmm. Which concepts you are introducing to your students? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, well, so I mean, we could go down probably a long list, but let's start with something like method. Like philosophical method. I mean, I think students are taught method in North America that amounts to logic, deduction. What is philosophical method? Well, it is coming to a reliable conclusion about something in whatever way that happens to be. And so I want to talk about people like Odira, Oruka, and sage philosophy at that point, because that's another version of method which is much more connected to culture and history and people, and yet it's still philosophical. And I want to ask students, okay, so what do we make of this as a philosophical method? Not an anthropological method, not a sociological one, but a philosophical one. And I think it just changes the conversation around method. Right? Now we have to think, how does philosophy relate to where it is lived, not just this abstract level, where we might think it normally resides. When we get on concepts of race, students are often surprised to realize that race is understood differently in different places. And so I talk through how it's understood even in different places in Africa, South Africa versus Kenya. Versus other places. And it's often very different from the history of how it's understood in the U.S., or for that matter, Brazil, or, other places. And so it opens the door to thinking about concepts not as these kind of abstract things that we search for a single definition of, but as relational things. I mean, in Western philosophy, you could almost think of Wittgenstein at this point, these relational things where, the energy is in what happens when you compare two different versions of that, and they throw a light on each other, as it were. So, I mean, that's two examples. In epistemology, we could look at, Weredu's idea of truth as opinion. Okay, so what does that mean in the West? That truth is not opinion. Knowledge is true justified belief, or opinion, and so you need more for knowledge. But here's Weredu saying something else. So, I think it gets us into how we deal with a tradition of knowledge that's embedded within a culture, within ancestors, within all sorts of things that are not just floating around up here at the abstract level.
Mm-hmm. So interestingly, Odira Oruka, who you met personally and you mentioned now here too, used the interview as a method to philosophize. So maybe we are doing oral philosophy here at the moment.
Maybe.
How do you see the future of African philosophy, philosophies of Africa? Yeah,
I'm actually excited about the future. I mean, when Emmanuel was first pulling me into the area, I looked around and I thought, well, there's stuff going on here, but it often felt like a lot of questions that people have been kind of batting around for years at that point. Chief of which was, is there an African philosophy? People were still talking about that, and if you look at the state of the field now, I think it's vastly different. I mean, that question may come up, but it's a lot of interesting stuff coming up now. And I think people are starting to take seriously the differences within Africa on ways of thinking about things. Moving away from the idea that Africa is any kind of singularity, and that people somehow believe the same, across the continent. I'm actually very optimistic. I often, to my students and sometimes in papers, I will use the image of the history of feminism. And if you look at the history of feminism, there's a long history when the arguments that feminists were making were arguments about the inclusion of women in kind of a mainstream of education or philosophy or whatever. And it's almost as if it comes to a point at which that project almost runs itself out. Like, the people who we are going to try and convince, we've convinced the ones we're going to convince. The others we're never going to convince. So now, what does it mean to do philosophy from women's experience? And that opens up a whole new set of questions, right? So you start getting care ethics, you start getting standpoint epistemology, you start getting all sorts of things that are contributions from women's experience, not just something that only women might care about, let's say, a kind of a regional or small, off to the side sort of concern. Now it becomes a central concern. I mean, you can't teach ethics in this day and age, in my opinion, without, taking care ethics into account and feminist contributions. I mean, it's just so central. I think African philosophy is making that turn. Right? That's why I use that image, because I think it's making a turn towards, we've convinced anyone who's going to be convinced that African philosophy is a real thing and that it matters. Now, what are the concepts that Africans have that can be contributed to the rest of the world? And I think there's loads of them. Right? I mean, my latest book on African philosophy and an activist cognition is really an attempt to say, look, a lot of what we're talking about in activist cognitive science, you can find in African philosophy, and it's been there for a while. Right, and so, that's exciting to me.
Mm-hmm. Even so, you see such a potential in African philosophy and the discourses in philosophy in Africa. Do you also see obstacles, problems, pitfalls in the discourses in Africa or about Africa? What should be maybe avoided or improved, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, take one step, look around, take another step, look around. I don't think it's a project that can be defined very far in advance. I mean, a lot of the problems that have always existed remain, right? I mean, the problems of the legacies of colonization remain. The problems around, inadequately supported education systems remain. I think maybe the potential answers might change. I've become persuaded by Derek Bell, who was a legal theorist in the U.S. Who wrote on racism, and one of his central arguments was that racism never goes away. I mean, if you think that you're going to be anti-racist and it will go away, and then you can start, turn over a new leaf and then start, you're fooling yourself. What happens is that racism always just reconfigures itself. It finds a new vocabulary. It finds a new way of. It never goes away. So the question changes then. That is, how can we be creative under that circumstance? And I think the same is true of colonialism. If we think that it's going to, if some anti-colonial effort is going to finally, shed the legacy, and then we can move forward into a new day, I don't think that's ever going to happen. But, someone like Achille Mbembe, I think, writes very eloquently about how it is possible to be hopeful and to move forward, even if that is the case, right? I mean, I think Achille is quite brilliant on that, actually. So, so I guess I don't think so much in terms of barriers, and I think more in terms of how we need to change the questions that we are asking about the situation we find ourselves in order to lead to new kinds of outcomes and new kinds of answers. You know, the problem comes when we just keep asking the same question over and over again, and there's a diminishing return to it. You know, we've tried all the kinds of answers, and you know, we're not getting any further.
Yeah, and so far, of course, it is wonderful to observe that African philosophy today is far beyond the question, what is African philosophy, or what is what is philosophy in Africa? What does it exist? And
exactly.
Here there's a lot of progress. You are right. Okay, my final question is: since you worked on both African philosophies, but also philosophies of the African diaspora, you worked on Sylvia Wynter, for example. How do you see the relation, and what are the potentials in both discourses, and how do you see, could they progress?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there's huge potential there. I mean, you know, figures like Sylvia Wynter, Amy Césaire, Suzanne Césaire, who I've written on, you know, they look to elements of Africa with a great deal of respect, but they were doing their own project, right? I mean, you know, I don't think there was an attempt to somehow emulate, you know, what was going on in Africa. They were trying to think about, you know, Martinique or Jamaica or whatever place they were writing from. You know, I think some of those diasporic writers bring a kind of reflective experience that's both inside and outside to African experience, right? And I think there's a kind of a struggle with what it means to have that legacy while not currently being in that space. I think that's a creative moment. And I think the more that African writers can engage those figures, not to kind of like recover them or something as if, you know, we're trying to do a kind of a project of identity, you know, are they African or aren't they? You know, I'm a big believer in, you know, this is why I work on place. You know, places, when we allow them to, you know, interact with each other, give us a creative spark, right? Because we start seeing difference. And that difference need not be a kind of antagonistic difference. It may simply be, you know, you understand this concept this way, I do this way, and now I'm able to look back on my own, like reflexively look back and understand what I think better than I could have just by thinking about it myself. There is such good work being done in the diaspora in so many places, and I would love to see more interchange. You know, there has been interchange. I mean, you know, everyone loves Fanon in Africa, and he's, you know, from Martinique, with lots of African experience, of course, but, you know, there are plenty of figures who have gone back and forth. I mean, Biko read, you know, civil rights figures in the U.S., you know, in thinking through what Black consciousness ought to look like. So, you know, there's a history of doing that, and I'd love to see more of that.
Thank you so much for allowing us to ask you all these questions. Thank you very much for your great contribution to our workshop.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.